guys, welcome back to Textory. In case you don't know what Textory is, it is a podcast where we read historical texts and we judge people. We just have fun. I must admit that the heroines of today's episode do not really deserve to be judged, which is wild because they're all criminals. So it's wild that I'm saying this, but a lot of it has to do with the era that they lived in, and I'm very much about supporting women's rights and wrongs. So this episode is a prime example of that. No, to be fair though, like obviously some of the things that they've done are they're still not illegal, but I just find it really interesting how we have this vision of women, and these are 18th century women. So there is this stereotype of Marie Antoinette style pastel macaron eating nymphs, basically. And what we're reading today is basically like the polar opposite of that. It's working class women, it's lower class women, it's women who had no fucks to give because they were just too busy, and women that were very bold in the way they went about life. Let me just say that in the most delicate way possible. But basically, as a sort of intro, let's just talk about 18th century London, because that's the place that we are sort of in today. Again, we probably have this stereotype of historical London being a very manly place, being a place where male politicians, male aristocrats, male merchants lived and dwelled. But I think it's only because of history's erasure of women, and nothing infuriates me more. And if you watch my YouTube channel, you will know that when people say, we fought for gender equality, but now a lot of women wish they just could go back to the olden days when they didn't work. And I'm just like, where did you hear that? They did work. And they go like, oh, yeah. I mean, they did a lot of unpaid labor at home. And I'm like, no, I don't just mean that. They worked in a variety of industries, on a variety of positions. It's not the Industrial Revolution that first brought women into workforce. They've already been working for centuries. They worked as servants, they worked as innkeepers, washerwomen, cleaners, they repaired clothes. And not only that, they owned their own successful businesses. Just in London alone, which is today's topic, as I've mentioned, there were hundreds of female-owned businesses in a variety of industries. And some were owned by single women, some were owned by sisters, some were owned by siblings, some were co-owned. So a wife would co-own a business, but she usually would not appear in the name of the business, which is why we tend to think that it was mostly men who owned businesses. Oh, I just dropped a hairpin in case you heard that. Which is why we think that it's only men that owned those businesses, because women were just not formally in the name, but they completely, they run the places. Anyway, this is just a disclaimer because it's definitely something I'm passionate about. And I feel like this particular topic is dealing with this sort of myth that women were just timid, locked off in their houses. They were not doing anything. No, they also committed crimes, apparently. They committed a variety of crimes, and I think it's much more interesting to think of them as real human beings that made mistakes, that misbehaved, that did things that were illegal, because it just gives them much more character and it humanizes them in our eyes instead of having this weird, mysterious vision of what we think they were like. So today we are reading court records of women whose crimes in most cases did not go unpunished. If you've listened to the very first episode of Textory, you might remember that we had a similar topic. And similarly to then, we will also be looking at records from the Old Bailey, which used to be a London-based courthouse. But as I mentioned, today we're moving a century forward because we talked about 17th century petty thefts, where people would steal someone's cap or a pocket. Today we're moving forward to 18th century, and we will be looking at a wide variety of crimes that women committed at the time. And it's not really the type of crimes you would think. You would probably think, okay, someone was a prostitute, they got caught, someone stole something. No, you're not ready. Anyway, I absolutely love the Old Bailey database. This could honestly be several episodes. in the 18th century, they also started writing down the whole dialogue from court cases at the time. So we are not actually reading that because it will be too long, but this is definitely something I will look into for future episodes because it reads basically like a legal drama. But no, today we are just focusing on the shorter entries that tell you what they've done, when they've done it, who they've done it with, and what the punishment was and what the sort of context was. So let's begin. 15th of January, 1700. Cecilia Labrie, alias Bailey, alias Jackson, and Jane Biggs, alias Deverell, alias Atkinson, of the parish of St. James Duke's Place, were indicted for counterfeiting the current coin of this kingdom on the 13th day of January last. It appeared that they had been old offenders and had been convicted formerly, and the evidence being plain against them, the jury thereupon found them both guilty. Okay, I looked into this because it says that they've already done it before. They've already basically faked money before. And apparently in 1697, Cecilia Labrie was convicted for the same crime. And she was like, I'm pregnant though. And they were like, oh shit, we can't execute you then. And then they examined her and they were like, you're not actually pregnant. And she was like, haha, joke's on you. Anyway, long story short, I'm assuming she somehow got away with it because 3 years later, she was already doing the same thing. And what is interesting to me is she was found guilty and she was sentenced to death. I'm not sure about Jane, I don't remember, but Cecilia was sentenced to death. And then 4 years later, we have another entry in the records, which goes like this. Cecilia Labrie, who was formerly convicted for high treason for counterfeiting the current coin of this kingdom and pardoned on condition to transport herself out of the Queen's dominions and never to return no more, having broke the conditions of her pardon, is ordered to prepare herself for death. Am I right to understand that she just ignored what they said? They were like, okay, you don't have to actually be executed, but you must leave the country. And she was like, yeah, right. What have I done? And then they were like, then you must die, actually. At this point, it's just being reckless. If you've already been able to escape death twice, because in 1697, she was already sentenced to death. And then again in 1700, if you live to 1704, you just don't violate your pardon. Like, I'm sorry, I don't stand with Cecilia. Girl, you had plenty of time to think on your behavior. But what I do find interesting is that the whole technicality of being able to produce fake money, I would assume was something that was out of reach for a regular woman or two. But they must have had the whole production set up. They must have had everything that's needed to produce fake coinage. It fills me with joy. Let me just say that. I love independent women. And it's just hilarious to think that there were at least 2 women, because there's a lot more in the records that did the same thing. So there were probably hundreds of women in 18th century London that were a part of the underground, that were a part of the mafia, so to say. And this was probably just their independent venture. I don't think they were involved with anyone else, but that's even better. Like, I love your girly business. Another example of something that you could get punished for in the 18th century, which obviously is still a thing. 13th of October, 1736. Susan Wells was indicted for that she, as a witness for Edward Bonner, did swear she was at the Greyhound Inn in Smithfield with her husband, and that the said Bonner was in their company from 11 to 4 or 5, etc. The evidence was the same as above, guilty. So she basically lied in court, I'm assuming. She was imprisoned, which, considering all the punishments that were available at the time, is honestly not a bad thing. At least she wasn't branded on her cheek. Let me just say that. Another woman that was involved in a male-dominated field was Hannah Butler. In 16th of February, 1737, Hannah Butler, otherwise Pew, was indicted for assaulting and ill-treating William Walpole, and the prisoner pleaded guilty to the indictment. She was fined 1 shilling, which at the time I don't think it was that much money, and 1 month of prison, which again, in terms of 18th century punishments, probably quite light. Which makes me think of how we nowadays also have the discussion of how men that are undergoing domestic violence or just are getting like beaten up by women, it's very difficult for them to come forward. And if they do, they're not really treated seriously. And it makes me think that in this case, if that were a man assaulting another man, he would probably get a bigger sentence. However, if it was a man assaulting a woman, that's probably another story entirely. But yeah, Hannah basically assaulted William Walpole. I wonder what ill-treating relates to. What were his arguments on the case? Then we have another case of something I would never imagine women to be able to do at the time, which is highway robbery. So 2 Elizabeths, Elizabeth Hancock and Elizabeth King, basically robbed someone in the street, in a highway, as they said at the time. So 25th of May, 1721, Elizabeth Hancock and Elizabeth King of St. Giles in the Fields were indicted for assaulting Peter Angels in the dwelling house of a person unknown near the highway on the 7th of this instant May, and taking from him a silver chain, value 3 shillings, and 5 shillings in money. But the evidence not being sufficient, the jury acquitted them. So they were not only skilled enough to, as 2 women, assault a man and steal from him, they also were smart enough to not leave any traces. And they were not sentenced, they were not punished. Which I think is very interesting. Again, I wonder if it has something to do with women being less likely to be criminals, but judging by how many entries these records have, women were absolutely responsible for like at least half of the crimes. I mean, I don't know the exact statistics, to be honest. So it's possible that it was only a small percent, but there were like hundreds of criminals that were women in London in 18th century. Hundreds or thousands even. Another example of highway robbery. We love women in male-dominated fields. 25th of May, 1721, the same day as the previous court hearing. Jane Worsley of St. James in Clerkwell was indicted for assaulting Margaret Pritchard on the highway on the 14th of April last, putting her in fear and taking from her a stuff riding hood and a linen sheet. So Jane, I would say it's more, I mean, yeah, okay, it is a highway robbery, but also like she stole clothes. I am not as much inclined to relate to her because she is not a girl's girl. She stole from a woman. If you're wondering how she did that, there is a description. The prosecutor deposed that she met the prisoner about 12 o'clock the night aforesaid at Cowcross, who asked her where she, the prosecutor, was going so late, who told her to Billingsgate in order to go to Sheerness, that the prisoner said it was not fit that a woman of her years should go so far and so late by herself, therefore said she would go with her. But when they came to Peter's Lane, the prisoner pulled her into an alley, stripped her riding hood off, and had like to throttle her. That she knew the prisoner again, they both living in one alley, and was sure she was the person that robbed her. Elizabeth Ellis deposed that the prisoner had lived by them 2 years. Whew, okay, this one's a little heavy. I must admit, I do not sympathize with Jane Worsley at all. Not only did she assault someone that I'm assuming was either older, like much older, or much younger, because she did make a comment about their age, she also pretended that she wants to keep her company for like protection. And then she stole from her. This is not a good look, Jane. I don't know what to tell you. I know we're getting into male-dominated fields, but that did not include being a creep at night. This is not cool. Anyway, the jury found her guilty and she was sentenced to death, which I find an interesting sentence for something so small because she only stole clothing. But I'm assuming it's like the whole thought process that went behind it, and also the fact that she did it in the most vile possible way. Maybe that's what got her such a sentence, because she was just not easy to relate to the people that voted for it. I don't know. I actually don't know. Okay, this one's really, really sad, because we know now the way that postpartum takes a toll on women's health and women's mental health. And we know that most of infanticides are obviously related to that mental health. But back then, when they didn't have all that context, they didn't know about postpartum psychosis, they didn't know about postpartum depression, they probably just assumed it's a crazy woman that killed her own baby. On 24th of April, 1734, Mercy Hornby of Stoke Newington was indicted for the murder of her female bastard infant by casting it alive into a privy, by which casting it received one mortal bruise on the left side of the head, of which mortal bruise it instantly died March 15th. She was a second time indicted on the coroner's inquest for the said murder. It is said that it was a bastard infant, which I think puts even more context into this, because what else was she supposed to do? I can easily imagine a girl in 18th century London being subjected to all the societal expectations, being judged, and she probably just didn't know any better solution. Like, how desperate do you have to be to put your infant baby into basically the toilet? And it has happened nowadays as well. Like, there are cases of that, which again, like, I think a lot of them can be attributed to the mental problems that women deal with postpartum. But this is another level. Like, this also brings the societal level of being basically dead to society as soon as any news of it comes out. I don't know who Mercy Hornby was. I don't know her social status. But this also could be a big, big factor in committing this crime, which is obviously horrible. I'm not trying to justify it. I'm just like trying to understand what happened here and where she came from. Anyway, she was found guilty and she was sentenced to death, which from what I've seen from the other cases was the most common punishment for infanticide. Another couple of women that did something that you would think mostly men did, which is they murdered a guy in 1735. And again, it's interesting to me when it's like women on men crime, because it does seem quite unusual, even in terms of like the power balance. Even though 18th century men were probably not prime examples of health, I would still, as a woman planning a murder, would probably be a little hesitant just in case he's stronger than me. Maybe because it was Elizabeth Armstrong, ha ha ha. She didn't worry about that. Anyway, 15th of October, 1735, Elizabeth Armstrong and Mary Price were indicted for the murder of Patrick Darling. Armstrong, by giving him with a knife one mortal wound in the calf of the right leg, of the depth of 2.5 inches and the breadth of 1.5 inches, September 24th, of which wound he died the same day. And Price, by being present, aiding and abetting Armstrong in the said murder. They were a second time indicted on the coroner's inquisition for the said murder. I know I said that we're not going to go into like the actual dialogue that went on in the courtroom, but there is a quote from one of the witnesses that speaks on what happened, and I thought it's quite interesting. So you're going to have like a sample of what was written down as a sort of protocol. They definitely wrote it like word for word, or at least, I don't know, just the way they describe things is very, like there's a whole narration that goes on, which I find really interesting, because you would think that it's supposed to be very neutral as to not influence anyone. But I don't know. Tell me what you think. Martha Harper. I went into Mr. Humphrey's brandy shop in Winford Street to spend a halfpenny. The deceased was there, and who should come in but this Mary Price? Now, the deceased was a mighty joking man, and he told her she carried a clean heel, God. "Yee," says she, "what is that like?" "Why," says he, "it is like an Irish leg, as thick at bottom as it is at top." With that, she up with her leg and kicked him on the parts, and he hit her a box on the ear. So they got into a physical altercation. She reeled against the door and said, call my cousin, call my cousin. She's at the gin shop next door." So came her cousin, the other prisoner Armstrong, and with an oyster knife in her hand, and swore she'd cut his nose off. Honestly, well deserved. He was the one that started playing games. He laughed and said, "Sure you won't serve me so." She swore yes, but she would, and called him Irish thief. There is this national aspect of it. She went out, he followed, she gave him a push, and I don't know whether he pushed her again, but she turned short and stabbed him in the breast. When he saw his blood, he knocked her in the kennel, and while he was beating her there, she cut him in the leg. And her Aunt Price called out, "Kill him, Betty, kill him." Okay, so Mary Price is her aunt, but she said it's cousin. Okay, never mind. Whew, that sounds like a whole mess. I'm not sure if I understood his first joke. He told her she carried a clean heel. Was it like a comment on her appearance? I'm actually not sure. It definitely went the wrong way. Like, shit went down. A lot of it is, I'm assuming, like, is it called like affectation? When you just kill someone because you're too overcome by your emotions to think clearly. Yeah, it does sound bad. It does sound pretty bad. And also her aunt going like, kill him, kill him. I think self-defense is enough, Mary Price, but go off. Funnily enough, Mary Price was actually acquitted, but Elizabeth Armstrong was found guilty and sentenced to death. Another crime that you probably associated with men rather than women is bigamy. So on 6th of July, 1737, Mary Sharlock, otherwise Patterson, was indicted for marrying William Plummer, August 15th, 1730, her former husband Francis Patterson being then alive. I think she knew that her former husband is still alive and kicking, and she probably concealed it from her then another husband, which I find really interesting because it's definitely something I thought happened more the other way. But she was found guilty and she was sentenced to branding, which I think is quite nasty. And then one of my favorite cases from 1726 is a woman that basically kept a gay sex club. No, like honestly, like it literally is just that. So Margaret Clapp was indicted for keeping a house in which she procured and encouraged persons to commit sodomy on the 10th of December last and before and after. Samuel Stevens thus deposed, so that's his sort of confession. On Sunday night, the 14th of November, I went to the prisoner's house in Field Lane, Holborn. I found near men 50 there, making love to one another, as they'd call it. Sometimes they'd sit in one another's laps, use their hands indecently, dance and make curtsies and mimic the language of women. Who are those divas? And then he gives an example of like what they said when they were mimicking women. "Oh, sir, pray, sir, dear sir, Lord, how can you serve me so? Ah, you little dear toad. Oh, that's so cute." Then they'd go by the couples into a room on the same floor to be married, as they called it. Oh, I mean, okay, I probably would not enjoy that place at all, but just the thought of gay men having this like one space where they could actually exist and do their all camp stuff that they wanted to do in the public, but they couldn't. I don't mean actually like being naked, but I mean pretending they're getting married or basically doing drag. It's just a little sad that this was considered such a massive crime. I mean, it's not a little sad, it's tragic, obviously. Anyway, at the same time, it's still a brothel. Knowing it's a gay brothel just makes it like make much more sense in terms of like what they were doing. The door at that room was kept by Ecclestone to prevent anybody from balking their diversions. When they came out, they used to brag in plain terms of what they had been doing, and the prisoner was present all the time except when she went out to fetch liquors. There was Griffin among them. Oh, not you dropping names, my guy. That's not cool. He's outing everyone. Griffin among them, who was since then hanged for sodomy. Oh, okay, he's already been persecuted. And Derwin, who had been carried before Sir George Martins for sodomical practices with a link boy. He bragged how he had baffled the link boy's evidence, and the prisoner boasted that what she had said before Sir George in Derwin's favor was a great means of bringing him off. So they had to confess in some case where someone was accused of basically being gay, and they lied in that court case, which, fair. What I find interesting is the guy that's confessing, because, my guy, how did you make it to the gay club without knowing it's a gay club? And if that wasn't suspicious enough, the fact that he was there in the first place, he then goes on to say, I went thither 2 or 3 Sundays following. Why would you go there again if you were so disgusted by all these naked gay men? Why would you keep going there just to make sure it's as bad as you think it is? Because he says, I went there 2 or 3 Sundays following and found much the same practices as before. Yeah, what did you expect? That they would just switch it up one day? Why would you go there twice after you've already been there? He is so suspicious. So my theory is he's actually a gay man himself that is terrified that someone's going to rat on him. And maybe someone did say something that made him think, okay, if I'm the one that spills the tea on this, at least I'm not going to be accused. Which, you do you, boo. Whatever you need to do to survive, I guess. They talked all manner of the and most vile obscenity in her presence. And she appeared wonderfully pleased with it. Honestly, we love an ally. Margaret Clapp, by the way, what an appropriate name. She was an ally. What can I say? She was just an ally. Joseph Sellers deposed to the same purpose and added he believed there were above 40 sodomies committed that night. Why would you go there just to observe? Tell me, why would a straight man go there just to make sure that gay men are having sex? Why would you... I just find it very interesting. I find it very interesting that someone's like, oh my God, there's gay people in there and they're naked. And straight men are like, oh my God, I need to make sure you're actually speaking the truth. I need to check it out. Why would you? The prisoner, in her defense, said that Darwin was taken up only for a quarrel and that it ought to be considered that she was a woman. And therefore, it could not be thought that she would ever be concerned in such abominable practices. Good call. Try and make it out using your female card. It might work. If they want to think you're just a stupid girl, play into it. If it's going to save your life or save you from branding, why not? But the evidence being full and positive, the jury found her guilty. She was found guilty of keeping a brothel, which I think is still quite light considering how many other laws she probably interfered with. And she was sentenced to stand in the pillory in Smithfield. So she was basically publicly mocked, let's say, and pay a fine of 20 marks and suffer 2 years imprisonment. That's quite a long sentence, isn't it? Compared to all of the other sentences that we've read in this episode. In terms of imprisonment, I think it's the longest one. Anyway, that was the last case that I wanted to read to you guys today. I think you now understand what I'm saying. A lot of it is woo, female empowerment, but then you're yeah, but they also killed a man, which is not great. So you're trying to be supportive, but at the same time, you don't want to support actual criminals. But overall, I think regardless of what crimes they committed, I'm not saying it's good to see that women were as bad as men, but I think it definitely paints them in a different light and it gives them more depth in a way. And to me, it just, as I said, it turns them more into humans than those shadows of women. And it definitely changes the way I see 18th century society. When I imagine if I was an 18th century woman walking down the street at midnight, my biggest fear could not be just a man assaulting me, but also a woman stealing my cloak. So, which is really interesting because actually a personal story here. The only time I was ever like attacked in the street was by a woman, and it was in like daylight. I think she was on drugs, but she was basically trying to strangle me. And I was like, oh, okay, we don't do that here. We don't do that here, lady. Like nothing really serious happened. I didn't even report it, but I just think it's ironic given how much fear there is, and rightly so, of getting attacked by men, that sometimes women are also not very trustworthy, and that was already the case in the 18th century London. So that's the moral of the story. Just stay safe out there, you guys. And if you want to commit crimes, at least make them podcast worthy, because who knows, maybe 100, 200, 300 years from now, someone will find your court records and be like, that's interesting. I need to make a podcast episode about it. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll see you or hear you in another episode. Bye.